Thank you, David, and thank you to the NCRI for inviting me to today's very important conference. And I, like many other of my parliamentary colleagues, am honoured to be with you and with the other distinguished speakers that we have today. I want to begin my remarks by saying to the families of the victims of the 1988 massacre in Iran and the survivors, some of whom will share their ordeals with us today, and also the people of Iran who may be able to listen to this conference either today or at some future time. We hear your voice. We share your outcry for change. And let me be clear, you are not alone. There are many cross-party MPs and peers in the United Kingdom that are standing shoulder to shoulder with you against this gross injustice. We support you, and we will advocate on your behalf until those responsible for this heinous crime against humanity in Iran are brought to justice and are prosecuted by the full extent of the applicable laws. Now, I'm very disappointed that the UK government abstained from the vote in the United Nations Security Council to extend the weapons embargo on Iran. Sadly, we are aligning ourselves with a failed policy of appeasement pursued by the European Union, which for the last 4 decades has provided the regime in Iran with immunity for its egregious human rights violations, including the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, and on its terrorism to preserve diplomatic dialogue, prioritise trade, and in recent years, keeping alive a disastrous and flawed nuclear deal that ultimately will allow Iran to advance its nuclear and missile program. Now, I was hoping, as many of us others were, that after our exit from the European Union, the United Kingdom would have altered its appeasing Iran policy, and I believe that is what is required for a successful global Britain. Now, it's clear that the appeasement policy pursued by the European Union has been completely counterproductive and has actually only enabled the regime to be emboldened. Now, remember, as we speak, the regime's terrorism has reached European territory. We now know that one of its diplomats is awaiting prosecution for planning a bomb plot against the gathering of the pro-democracy opposition, the NCRI, in Paris in June 2018. I personally and my wife could have been victims if that terrorist attack had been successful. So for me, it is deeply personal. Now, if we just read the recent Amnesty International report, which documents the regime's brutal crackdown on the nationwide protests in Iran since 2019 and the killings of protesters and torture against those arrested, it brings home to everyone what is really going on. Now, imagine if we stand idly by and allow that same regime to arm itself to the teeth with deadly and sophisticated weapons from China or Russia. Obviously, this must change, and the United Kingdom should respectfully reject the European Union's approach on Iran and join our American allies in exerting maximum pressure on the regime in Iran. Make no mistake, the regime in Iran only understands the language of firmness. Like criminals in our own society, the regime in Tehran will contemplate altering behaviour only when its leaders and officials are actually held to account for their crimes and aggression. Now, I share my thoughts of my good friend Steve McCabe, who I think has had to leave our conference in referring to that report. Last year, Amnesty International repeated the same call as demanded by the Iranian resistance with regards to the detainees of the November 2019 protests. It stated that this regime has shown that it will not investigate its own crimes, and therefore it is vital for the United Nations member states to enter and call for independent international investigation on all their crimes, and most importantly of all, on the 1988 massacre. How has our government responded to this? You say you want to achieve achievement in human rights situation through bilateral contact with the Iranian authorities. Let's be honest. that the United Kingdom government have talked about Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe for years. It has achieved nothing. The United Nations General Assembly has passed 66 resolutions which only condemns the violations and expects the mullahs to behave better. The United Kingdom government must admit that nothing has changed. Therefore, it's now time for accountability. If our new Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office wants to see a real change in human rights situation in Iran, it must now bring the issue of accountability into the resolution on Iran in the coming United Nations General Assembly. This is how the mullahs start taking the international community seriously, and they will know that the game is over and they cannot fool the world with their deceptions in all fields. Therefore, from what I've said and what my colleagues have said, the following steps are needed. The United Kingdom government must use its new global sanction regime to announce punitive measures against those who are responsible for the 1988 massacre and serious human rights violations in Iran today, which tragically is the very same people, like the regime's Chief Justice, Ebrahim Raisi, and the current Justice Minister, Reza Avai. The UK must work with allies at the United Nations to extend the weapons embargo against Iran without delay and to reimpose all of the international sanctions and the United Nations Security Council resolutions on the regime. The United Kingdom must take the lead at international level and work with allies at the United Nations to establish an independent inquiry into the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners in Iran, by including the demand for such investigation in this year's United Nations resolution on Iran, which the United Nations General Assembly is expected to adopt later this year. Now, these three steps should be completed with public support of the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people and the Iranian Resistance Movement, the NCRI, led by President-elect of the NCRI, Madam Rajabi, as the basis for a very firm British policy on Iran. Because in my personal view, the United Kingdom now needs to prepare for the Iran without the theocracy. The United Kingdom must stand with the Iranian people and the resistance movement, the NCRI, at this time when people across the whole of Iran have taken to the street to demand change and to protest against the regime's corruption and repression. Otherwise, the United Kingdom stands on the wrong side of history and would be remembered for this colossal mistake by future generations in Iran. So I close by saying thank you once again for inviting me to speak to this wonderful conference. I wish you all every success in overturning the regime of the mullahs, and I look forward to the time when not only can we meet physically, but we can actually meet physically in a free, democratic Iran.